Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas, and how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
So, compañeros, welcome to episode 106. Thanks again for tuning in today. Our topic, welcome to episode 106. Thanks again for tuning in today. Our topic is temporal tables.
Yes, and our guest today on that temporal tables topic is Randolph West. You may remember Randolph from our indexing episodes that we did at episode 81 and 82.
That's right.
If you haven't heard those, go back and check them out because those are some, well, they're all good episodes, but those were some really good episodes.
That's right.
And Randolph works at Born SQL, which his URL is bornsql.ca. And he is a data platform MVP. And Born SQL provides SQL Server services in Western Canada. And occasionally he'll work across the border and do some stuff with us.
That's right. He's still willing to dip his toe across this way. And,
Yep.
And when he's not doing SQL Server work, you might find him on a movie set.
That's true. You can check out his IMDb.
Death, but that episode 81, rather. So episode 81 on indexes is still one of our highest listened to episodes to date. So,
Wow.
let's see. We have a couple of compañeros shout outs today we want to mention. And Matthew Summers from Jacksonville, Florida reached out. And we were chatting a bit, and he said, it's kind of the craziest thing. So it's not just our content, but some of the other content that's out there. He talks about the timeliness of it, right? And he's like, hey, I'm having this problem. And then, it's scary how many times that the topic speaks directly to the, oh my gosh, I need this right now moment. And so Matthew, you're welcome.
So it's almost as though we had a crystal ball to be able to see what he needs, and we're providing that.
Yes, that's right. I think Matthew should probably invest in some new security measures.
Yes.
Yeah.
And our next shout out was from Doug Lane, and he's from Eastern Iowa, and he chimed in and thought that our podcast was good stuff. And he's one of those people we need to have on the show.
I agree. He's one of those we have not made an invitation to Doug yet, and we need to get him on. And we have the last person from Iowa that I can remember was Todd Clint, our SharePoint episode. And so, we need to get a good Iowa boy on and talk about SQL Server.
Yeah, but one thing you may know Doug from, if you've ever seen him present at a PASS conference, he does some pretty cool stuff.
That's right. Or from a karaoke, like a SQL karaoke. I think he's been one to grab the mic and go for it.
Yep.
So last night, as we were recording this, I went down to the Hampton Roads user group and presented there. And there I met Gretchen Pham. I think I'm saying that correctly. Anyway, it was nice meeting her, and we talked a bit about it, and she thought that would be a lot of fun, and that it looked great. We thought, hey, chatting with her, it's going to be very nice for her to be there, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy getting to know her. But we think that there are a few more listeners that might want to come, and we have a discount code for you. We'd like to offer you $75 off.
And the discount code is Compañero.
Compañero.
And hopefully everyone listening to the show knows how to spell that now, because we've stumbled over it a few times, especially in episode 100. But if you don't know how to spell it, you can go to sqldatapartners.com/temporal for the show notes.
Yes. We'll have the link there.
Yep.
And then you can click to the website and you can copy it up from the top.
Yep.
Use that code Compañero if you're listening to the show, and you can get $75 off admittance to the conference.
Yeah.
Which admittedly is not all that high. So right now it's currently at $4.99.
Yep.
Use that code Compañero if you're listening to the show, and you can get $75 off admittance to the conference.
Yeah.
Which admittedly is not all that high. So right now it's currently at $499. And from a conference perspective, we think that's pretty good. Ultimately, we're looking to put together a conference that is going to be credible not only to you, but also to your boss or the person who hopefully will be paying for the conference, that you'll finally be able to use some of that training budget that you never quite seem to be able to get around to. And so we hope that you'll come and hang out with us, learn some SQL, and also meet some new people at the same time.
Yep. And to get the best price possible right now, if you use that code before the next price increase, you'll be in good shape.
That's right. So our next price increase will be August 16th. So you have between now and August 16th at $499, and then it will be going up just a little bit after.
If you're having trouble.
Our show notes page for today's episode is at sqldatapartners.com/temporal, however you want to say that.
Or at sqldatapartners.com/106 if you're having trouble spelling temporal.
Yes.
Or temporal. Or, yes.
So those of you who are a little bit better with numbers, right, than letters. Yeah. Yep. That's one thing that that the internet needs to do better at, right? Is auto-correcting URLs. That may or may not be a good thing, actually.
Right. Yes, indeed.
Okay, so I guess with that, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Randolph. Okay, Randolph, welcome again to our program.
Thank you for having me. I'm surprised I survived the last round, but this is going to be interesting.
Yes, we actually split that into two. We had you on for a double header, and so it's been about 30 episodes, and so we wanted to have... Yes, we actually split that into two. We had you on for a double header, and so it's been about 30 episodes, and so we wanted to have you back. Of course, we've been planning with you for the upcoming conference, the Compañero Conference, and so we're excited to have you speak there.
I'm excited to speak as well. It'll be very cool because the cloud is all very rah shiny, but some reasons why you shouldn't just jump into that.
Sure. Yeah, especially it's interesting you bring that up because I just happened to be reading today. So Microsoft, it used to be $4 billion. They said $15 billion last year.
Yeah.
In the cloud. So yikes. Lots of people in the cloud.
So we'll be covering how to appropriately take advantage of that $15 billion.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
That's exactly
without being milked for a big percentage of it.
Well, some of that budget is going towards trying to convince people to go across to the cloud. So it's an interesting
That's true.
time.
And I think ultimately what we're kind of getting at here is they're trying to give us additional ways to do auditing. Ultimately, right? I mean, they tried with some like change data capture, maybe even some other components. We all have a lot of the homegrown components, right, for audit.
Yeah.
But that ability to kind of see what was there before it was updated and whatnot, that seems to be the focus of temporal tables. Would you agree with that?
I would agree up to a point because temporal tables do not keep track of the user that performed the change.
Gotcha. Okay, very good. So that is kind of a distinction. When we talk about the word audit, that the person itself is not captured, only the value.
Yeah. Temporal tables, I'll quote kind of what Microsoft was saying, is that it is for auditing and forensics, but you don't know who the user is that made the change, so you will still have to keep track of that. But it also helps, and this is where I really like it, for data that's accidentally changed or accidentally deleted.
Interesting.
Plus, it also provides a point-in-time analysis of what the data looked like in the past. So you could say, show me what the table looked like at midnight 3 weeks ago, and then I can see what changed during that time using trend analysis or some type of complex query. And we can analyze what's happening over time using the data that's in the history table compared against the data that's in the current table.
Yep. And that's a real important feature there, I think, beyond the auditing side of it, because so often you'll get a report that shows like the last 30 days sales or something like that. And then once a couple days have passed, it may have changed drastically. And oftentimes you don't have a good way of seeing what that looked like last week or the week before for comparison. And temporal tables seem like a great way to be able to do that.
Yeah. And that's exactly when it changed. Yeah. And that's why it's my favorite feature of 2016, because now exactly that, you can go back in time and say, this record changed, and we can see exactly when it changed. And if you are keeping track of your logins and things like that, this is where the auditing comes in, but also with the tracking changes in a more sensible way. There are obviously limitations to how this works, because you're eventually going to run out of space. But we can get into that if you like. So,
do you think that, I guess, are those features going to continue to be separate? Do you think? I guess we're kind of prognosticating a little bit here, right? But that idea is the user going to make it into the temporal table feature, or is that going to remain outside of what this feature set is?
I think if they want to pursue an auditing feature, then they do need to include the user at some stage. Saying that, though, there are a lot of systems that user, if you like, systems that don't use system IDs for tracking users. They have their own. For example, when you log into a web application, your user account may just be a table entry inside a user table, so a row in a table, and then there is no necessarily a good way of tracking which user that is from the temporal table point of view, because it's not a system user that's accessing it, because there's only one system user, if you like. So
sure.
They probably will bring it in eventually. I don't know. I'm not using any MVP magic here. I don't know. But they probably will bring it in. But at the same time, you should be tracking that anyway if you have your own table of users that you're using to track logins. So I think you can combine the two and see who's doing.
Well, that's an interesting point. I guess one that I hadn't considered. So having not used temporal tables before, but that idea of your, let's just say, Active Directory account has application, but then the application talks to the database with a single account, right? That architecture would have to change a bit to take advantage of some of that, right?
Yeah, well, I don't think you have to change the architecture. I think you just have to be aware that the users accessing the data are internal to the database or to the SQL instance. And in that respect, you would have to track them separately. So right. Your architecture might have to change, but I don't see temporal tables architecture changing if they do add system user tracking at some stage.
Right. Yeah, let's jump into some of the, other use cases. Like what other reasons are people putting in temporal tables?
So the big reason for me is history, keeping track of history. So one of the systems I built a while ago was to keep track of all records changes that happen in the system. So whenever a row is deleted or updated, I keep a copy of what it used to look like in an auditing table, if your data auditing table. And then if I ever needed to go back into the history, I would have to go and query with horrific XML queries to try and figure out exactly what is going on. Because for example, if you're keeping track of all the history for all the tables, you can't just go and create a beautiful table structure around that. You have to use XML.
Right.
You'd have to shred the XML to go and read that. And that would either require an index that is 5 times the size of your data, or a very slow query as it goes to read everything.
Yep.
So what this does is, in a way that you would create a trigger on a table to keep track of the old row and then store it somewhere, this does exactly the same thing under the cover. So when you create a temporal table and then you create the history table that's linked to that, whenever a row is deleted or updated in the current table, the old row will be kept in a history table. So on a temporal table, the history table that's linked to that, whenever a row is deleted or updated in the current table, the old row will be kept in a history table, just like you would do with a normal trigger. The functionality under the covers is exactly the same.
The advantage is it's going to give you a little bit more detail, right? It's going to add that begin and start date, or the date parameter to it.
Right. So it's
going to take care of all that.
It's all effective dated. So every row on a temporal table has to have a start and an end timestamp. It's date time 2. Yeah, the full 8 bytes. So date time 2 goes down to 100 nanoseconds. That is the smallest granularity, and that's the granularity you have to use for, I hate that word. That's the granularity you have to use for system date times for the temporal tables. So there's a start time and an end time. When you create the table, the 9 December the 31st, for example, and then if you see a row in the history table that has a end time and then you do not find that row in your current table, that means it was deleted. Otherwise, if the row exists in the current table, it was never deleted, it was just changed. So a little bit of trickiness to understand how things work, but it's all date time specific.
So then take the example of someone who's not quite on SQL Server 2016 yet, and they want to use something like this. I mean, they could just create the same thing with their own trigger.
Correct, yes.
And with a similar naming convention on the start time and end time and all of that. However, where it would get challenging, it seems like, and we haven't talked about querying it, would be when you're trying to query that data.
Well, yeah. So the query uses a different type of querying than we're used to. There's a keyword, likely go and figure out of querying than we're used to. There's a keyword that you have to use. And I'm just going to get it here. System time.
Yep.
So you have to use the keyword system time in your query. So select whatever from the table for space and then system underscore time. And then you can do an as at a certain timestamp. You can use a between. There's a number of different things that you can use that it'll automatically go and figure out what the timestamps are between the current table and the history table.
Yep. And to me, that seems where some of the real value is, in that even though it just triggers under the scenes and all that, the value is the way that SQL Server has built that in to be able to query for a specific point in time or a range or a set of values.
Yeah, and that's the value for me as well. So I can go and see exactly what the data looked like at that specific point in time down to the 100 nanoseconds. So if originally had, and we find out that somebody deleted a whole bunch of rows, we can go back to the exact point in time before it happened. We don't have to go and restore an entire database or a file group restore if we're doing Enterprise Edition. But we don't have to do that anymore. We can now go into the history table, recover all those rows, then flush the history table, because otherwise you're going to have 3 times the data that you originally had. And I'll explain that as well. So if you're recovering data, you go into the history table, you get those rows out, you flush the history table, and then you import the rows back into the current table. Then you've got your consistent data before the delete happened, and then you reconnect the history table to the current table again.
Okay, so you use the term flush the history table there.
Yeah.
What exactly does that do?
Well, the history table will grow and grow and grow until you run out of disk space. That's by design. So there's no aging out of the data. You have to do that. We can have page of the data. You have to do that yourself, which is good because if you're auditing, you decide how long you want to keep your data for. Saying that, though, the data is stored in a compressed format. So they use page level compression on the history table. So it's not going to, and because since 2016 Service Pack 1, we don't have to worry about compression because it's part of the product on standard edition as well. So we can have page compression for the history table. So it will use less space than it would normally, which is one of the advantages of the feature on 2016.
Now, remind me, because I guess one of the things that we've kind of implicitly said here is that, so we have a table. We now want to add this history to it. When we're going to use an alter table, that's going to change, and we're going to say, hey, this is now a temporal table. It's going to create this history table. Now, remind me, now
go up as what's called
seeing that history table, like in Management Studio, is that visible to me, or is that an object that I'm still managing, or is that kind of just behind the scenes?
You can see a temporal table in Management Studio as long as you obviously have the right permissions to view them. It will show up as what's called a system versioned temporal table because the system is versioning the table. I mean, this is Microsoft naming conventions, which we know and love. But what you'll see in Management Studio is you'll have the current table. Let's say, for example, dbo.account. And then in brackets behind it, they'll say system versioned. And then if you expand that out, it'll show you the history table under that first. And then it'll show you the columns, keys, constraints, all of that stuff that you're used to. So the history table will be You can name it yourself and put it in its own schema, which is what I recommend. So storage, or cheaper storage, whatever. And then you put your schema attached to that file group, and then you go and put the history stuff inside that schema. Then you can manage the history in a different file group, which might cost you less money. It'll be a little bit slower, but it's history data. So
Sure.
You wouldn't have had it in the first place.
Right.
And
You're not expecting super fast performance necessarily.
Exactly. And because it's compressed, you might actually offset some of that performance problem by having it compressed. And then you'll have the list of columns that would look exactly the same as they would in the current table, except you cannot obviously have a clustered index. I'm going to change that statement.
Okay.
You can have a clustered index, but you cannot have a primary key in the history table.
Gotcha.
Because the primary key is in the current table. So the history table does have a clustered index. It just doesn't have a primary key because the primary key is in the current table. Otherwise, the structure is identical.
Yeah. And I think the key behind that is that when you're inserting into that history table, if you had the primary key on the same thing as the original table, it wouldn't allow you to put those multiple rows in there.
Correct. So what's happening in the history table is that you have a clustered index. It's just not unique.
Right.
Right.
Because it's an append-only way of writing to the history table.
Yep. So then if we've got that history table and I want to clear out some old history in there, can I just go in and delete data out of that table?
You have to break the link between the current and the history table to be able to do that, which isn't complicated at all. There's just a command.
Alter table, set system versioning off.
Yes, that's the one, Steve. So modifying temporal tables. You have to have administrative rights to be able to alter a table. To be able to alter a table, you need the admin role to do that. So you cannot alter the object until you have administrative rights. So that's the first thing. Anybody can read and write from the temporal table and write to the temporal table, but only an administrator can modify it. And what you do there is alter table, the name of the table, set, and then brackets, system_versioning equals off. Then you can do whatever you like inside the temporal table with the full understanding that your auditing trail is now broken.
Sure.
So
it's almost like a maintenance window type.
Exactly. So
operation.
This is exactly the same thing as changing your database from full logging model to simple logging model is the recovery model. So now you have basically truncated or changed your history. So now you will have to recreate that connection once you're done flushing the table or deleting rows from there that you need, or rows from there that you need, or changing column names, or changing columns themselves, deleting columns, updating columns, whatever. Because you may change the structure of your current table and you want to have that change reflected in the history. Because unfortunately, although you can do an alter table which changes a column or drops a column on the current table, that will take place on the history table. But if you have decided to keep the history of a certain column and you do an alter table on the current, it will drop that column from the history, which you don't necessarily want. Then you have to break the connection, go into the history table, set that column to null, to nullable, and then recreate the connection again once you've dropped the column from the current table. So that way you can keep history of what the column used to have in it, but then the column doesn't exist anymore in the current table, so you've still got that history retained. Does that make sense, or did it just confuse you all?
No.
I think it makes sense. Yep.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
There's also another feature which I've never turned off. When you create the system versioning on a table, you can alter an existing table and create a temporal table out of it, which Carlos alluded to earlier, or you can create a new table from scratch, which is a temporal table. And to change an existing table, you have to alter the table, set system versioning equals on. Then you can assign it a history table name if you want to create something in your own schema that we spoke about. And then there's another feature called data consistency check equals on. The documentation says this should always be on to ensure that the history table follows the correct structure and format as the primary table. I'm not sure why you would want to turn that off. So I'm not sure why the feature is even presented as an option.
Right. Yes, because you made a change to that table, data type change, most likely, right?
Yeah.
Or add, I guess you can add a column.
Why have?
But I haven't had a chance.
I'm just letting you know that it is there. It is required with the altered table statement if you're going to use system versioning equals on, but I'm not quite sure why it's there.
So one thing, and I haven't used the data consistency check one way or the other, but one thing I was reading about in a blog post was that it was there to help deal with corruption at some point, which immediately I perked up a little bit and thought, well, I need to understand this one, but I haven't had a chance to dive into that yet. Have you heard anything about using that around corruption?
I have not, but I would imagine that if you have a corrupt table, and this is all conjecture on my part, if you have a corrupt table and you have a history table that contains all the history should probably be fine because it's stored in a different file group, for example, or a different part of the file anyway. You would have access to that history without necessarily reading or writing whatever's in the current table using different tables. So I'm in the current table using just standard queries. I believe that there was a bug in one of the cumulative updates did fix a bug in data consistency check for certain tables. So I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, Steve.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess that's something I need to look into a little bit more.
Because I do know that there was, in cumulative update 1, there was a bug with data consistency check.
Yep.
So maybe that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, so let's take an example here then. Let's say we create a table. We have system versioning on, and we have a history table associated with that. Then we insert a single row into that table. Does that row then exist in the table as well as the history table at that point? Or does it wait to get to the history table until it ends up being changed?
An insert was changed. That the history table is involved is if you modify that data. So when you insert a new row into a table, there's no reason for it to have changed at all. So you'll only see it in the current table. And then when you modify it, the timestamp will be kept track of. And the original row with the start time that you created the row in and an end time of when it was changed will show up in the history table.
Yeah. So if you've got a table then, for instance, it's something like bank account transactions, which is probably the type of table that's not going to change frequently. It'll have lots of inserts, but very rarely, I would hope, are transactions in the past being modified.
Well, I'm going to stop here and say that's bad accounting practice if you are changing, because then you should be posting changes in an append-only model with accounting.
Sure, exactly. But if you wanted to track to see if anything was actually changing it, you could. If anything was actually changing it, you could turn this on, go back and look and see at what point in time things were changing if they were.
Yeah.
But then I was going to sort of flip it around to a different example of, let's say you have a table that's like your users table, and that user has username and a last login date, where every time that user logs in, it updates their last login date.
Yeah.
That would be one that if temporal tables were turned on, every time the user logged in, it would be inserting another row into that history table, and it could grow very quickly over time.
It could, yes. And that's why the page compression is going to be very helpful from that point of view, because that data should compress very well.
Yep.
But saying that, it may not be a good choice for a temporal table, although it might be a good choice if that's what you want to do is audit and see how often people are logging in, things like that.
Right. So then in the case that you have a very narrow table, maybe it is just username and last login.
It's exactly the same.
Whatever you need there too as well. But if that's probably going to, work better in a history table than if you've got a user table that might have 150 user attributes defined in different columns. Again, a poorly defined table there. Because when it logs to the history table, of course, it's logging the entire contents of the row. Is that correct?
Correct. So wide tables are going to be slower because it's exactly the same effect as if you were taking that and using a trigger to write it to a different table. It's still going to be a wide table with possibly wide columns as well. So it's going to take a while to write, and you are going to have a performance impact on your current table because it has to commit the row to the history table first, obviously. The row will be modified in the current table, and then it will be modified in the history table. It's part of the same transaction, though.
Okay.
Barriers to,
Those foreign key relate same transaction, though.
Okay.
barriers to entry.
The big one for me is the disk space, because you're going to run out of space quickly. The other problem is if you're using this in a staging environment and you have more than one table with a foreign key relationship, and both of them are temporal tables, you're going to have a hard time trying to pin down history queries to say, what did the data look like at a specific point in time because of those foreign key relationships. So it gets a little bit hairy in that respect. You don't necessarily want to have every table in your database a temporal table, because it's going to make your queries complicated, and it's also going to slow you down because it's going to be querying the history all the time.
Okay. So in the select statement, then, when we're querying for temporal data, we're say for system time as of and a specific date time too. Now, if you do that in select from one table, that system time parameter going to apply to both of the tables in the join?
What a fantastic question. I'm going to say that time is specific to each table. So what I would do is I would run an experiment and then find out, because I don't know.
Okay.
We can figure
and again,
it out.
it's one of those new features where there's a lot of experimentation to do here, I think.
So where the challenge comes in is you may have history on a lookup table, for example. So the lookup table has a whole bunch of stuff that might change once in a while, and you don't necessarily look at the history when you're joining that to something else, but you might have to do that, and it gets a little bit hairy because it's difficult for the it's not difficult, it's just time consuming for the engine to go back into the history table as well, and then into the history table as well, and then because when you do a temporal query, I'm going to call it a temporal query, not a history query. When you do a temporal query against your table, it's going to combine the results from your history and your current if you're asking for everything. So it's going to do basically a union all, or a union, because the data shouldn't be the same. When you combine the two, if you're going to do a point in time query, it's going to go and look in the history to see if anything's there. So it's always looking in that history table. So if that is on slower performing hardware, then it's going to take longer. That's kind of where I'm getting to.
Okay.
I'm not sure that actually
that makes
answers
sense.
the questions. Next week.
All right.
Oh, I was going to say, when should you use temporal tables? You should use temporal tables on data that needs to be tracked and that you were tracking in place, but we're keeping track of the XML data version of history. I needed to track that for auditing reasons. That is a good reason to use temporal tables, but I wouldn't just go turning it on everywhere, because eventually you're going to forget, and eventually you're going to run out of disk space somewhere.
Yes, and hopefully you know about that before before you run out. Hopefully you have alerting in place.
Right, you should have alerting in place, but if you're playing with it on a test environment or something and you forget about it,
sure,
you may need a massive amount of space to handle that data. Some people might have to retain 7 or 10 years of history, and then you may have to age it out in a manual process anyway. So you don't know how much space it's going to use until you start doing some actual real life testing. That's the biggest thing that I have to say is the biggest limitation for me.
Okay.
I think I've said that 100 times. Testing. That's the biggest thing that I have to say is the biggest limitation for me.
Okay.
I think I've said that 100 times.
How about any other tips on the sort of care and feeding side of temporal tables?
Back to the disk space that's being used. If you are creating a lot of churn and your temporal table is growing excessively, you may want to think about going into the history, breaking the connection, and deleting or aging out data that is older than a certain number of months or years. And it's got indexes on it, so you might want to do some index maintenance as well. You can apply indexes to columns inside the history table manually if you like, by the way, which is pretty cool. But you cannot change the clustering keys. So you may want to do some index maintenance from time to time on the history table.
Then just with your temporal table, and you add indexes, non-clustered indexes to that, for instance, do they automatically end up in the history table, or do you need to go and add those manually if they're needed?
When you create a temporal table, the history table only takes the clustering index, so mainly the primary key and the structure of the table. There should be no reason for it to take the indexes across, because it's additional maintenance that's not necessary, because you're not necessarily going to be querying that table a lot. So it will only copy the structure, so the columns themselves, and whatever your primary key is will become a clustered index on the other side.
Okay.
There will not be any indexes that get copied across. So if you do want to query that table frequently, you would have to add your own indexes.
Right. So in that example, if we were querying for a specific point of time and filtering on a column
to your
got large, it could be quite slow.
Yes.
If we don't add that index ourselves.
Yes, and there's a whole can of worms there with filtered indexes, which don't always work the way you expect them to, which we won't get into.
Right.
I think we covered that in episode 81.
Yep. Okay, great. So any other care and feeding tips to add at this point?
When you make a change to your current table, the change, if it is structural, so you're deleting a column or modifying a column, may affect the temporal table as well, the history table. And the reason for that is because it wants to keep it in consistent check between the two. That's that data consistency check that's happening.
Okay.
So if there is data in the history table that doesn't satisfy the requirements of the new column, for example, you may have just deleted everything from the current table and then altered the column. If it is attached to, and you do an alter column and it then tries to change the data type, if the history table contains a data type that is incompatible with the new change, it will fail.
So you'd either have to purge the history table or null that column in the history table, perhaps, in order to be able to modify it in the original table?
For me personally, I would break that connection completely, rename that history table so that it's archived, and then create a new history table going forward. If the data types are that significantly different, because effectively it's a new table. If you do want to go and query that history, you still can by querying the history table directly in the archived version. But if you're going to be making structural changes to your current table, I would break the connection, rename the history table, and just create a new history table going forward.
Okay.
The other thing that I wanted to mention, we touched on very briefly earlier, is if somebody deletes, let's say, runs a delete statement against the current table without a where clause, so every single row gets deleted. What you'll find is that the original version of that row for every single row will find its way into the history table. So if you've got 10 rows, that's fine. If you've got 10 million rows, you're going to have 10 million rows in your history table as well. So if you want to recover that data, you can just copy that over from the history table into the current table. But I do recommend breaking the connection first, because any modifications you make to any rows after that will also be written back to the history table, and you've still got millions or 10 million changes in that history table. So either flush those rows out first or rename the table or do something. But how much are you able from the history table without doing some maintenance on the history table? Because otherwise you're still going to have those 10 million records there waiting in the history forever and ever.
Yep. So it really seems like it just keeps coming back to the history table can get really big depending on what you do. And it's may be slow if you don't index it. It may run you out of disk space. I mean, there may be any number of issues associated with that history table becoming gigantic.
Well, it's the usual story. How much are you querying it? So does that mean we're going to be using a buffer pool for that table? All of those things that go along with that, because even though it's compressed on disk, it's still going to be, whenever you read it into memory, it's going to be uncompressed. So,
yep. Okay, so
just be wary of that.
So then another question around this. I mean, let's say you're querying your original table and you're not using the system time parameter. you're just doing a direct query of your source table or your temporal table without the history.
Yeah.
Does that
There's another feature in
the same as it did if you did not have a temporal table?
That's That's an excellent question, because it brings up another thing that I didn't mention. Yes, it works exactly the same way as if nothing had changed. So when you create a new temporal table, you can create the start and end time using the datetime2 data type, and you can mark those columns as hidden. So there's another feature in 2016 for hidden columns, and this is specifically for supporting this feature. So you can hide those columns so that any queries that do, and you shouldn't do this, but people do, a select star, those columns will not be visible in a select star. They will not be visible in any existing applications that don't know that they're there, because the system is managing them. It's as if you had created a column with a default value, because that's effectively what it is.
Right, but those have to be specifically marked as hidden for them to not show up in the select star.
Correct. But if you do that, and you can do that, very easily when you're doing the create or the alter table to make it a temporal table, you can mark those columns as hidden. So it has no effect on any current applications or any queries that you might be using currently. It'll work exactly the same way as it did before. So unless you're using that system time query hint, or it's not a hint, keyword, it's going to carry on reading from the current table as if nothing else has happened.
Okay, great.
Good deal. Lots of good stuff today. As we kind of finish up here, I know we've done SQL Family before, but can we go ahead and hit it again?
We can do it again because my answer may have changed.
So Randolph, how did you first get started using SQL Server?
Accidentally, as with everybody I know. I used what they wanted to do all along. I used Access. I used MySQL. I used Ingress. I used SQL Server when I was working with PeopleSoft back in the 90s. And I didn't know what it was. It's one of those things, this just keeps your data. It's in a Excel spreadsheet, basically. Lots and lots of Excel spreadsheets. I started reading about corruption because that happened at two of the clients. The databases either got dropped or corrupted in some way, and I started getting interested in it that way. And basically, it's just, it was there. Let me have a look at it. And then I started loving it. Access was really my entry point into SQL Server because Access was so terrible.
Sure.
That's so interesting because at first glance, if you don't know databases very well, Access looks pretty darn cool. Databases very well. Access looks pretty darn cool.
Access has some very nice features for front-end development for a data backend. Well, it did. Yeah. I mean, it's 2017 now.
Sure.
But
back in time, it did.
Yeah.
Right. Well, they have it all in one application too, right?
Exactly.
I don't need two things.
And it was easier. It was easier to use than FoxPro. It was cheaper than FoxPro, and you didn't have to be a programmer to write a query because it had that cool query designer that you could do. And I believe SQL Server has the same thing, but I've never used it. And it was just really neat to be able to picture your data with a graphical interface. So yeah.
I wonder if Microsoft realizes that Access is really a stepping stone to get to SQL Server from people getting into. I'm sure they do.
It's a gateway drug.
Yes.
That's right. Well, now, if you could change one thing about SQL Server,
but I'm not sure if that's the one thing that I would change now.
Okay.
Because firstly, Azure SQL database has come a long way in a very short time. So if I would change one thing, it would be making Azure SQL database cheaper. Because I think there's a lot of potential for people to use for single application usage, for example, using an Azure SQL database to replace what people use MySQL for now. And that would be web applications and things like that. And if it were a little bit more cost effective with all the feature set that they have, because everything that's in SQL Server 2016 is in Azure SQL database, right. Including temporal tables on the premium edition and in-memory OLTP and all those things. So I think temporal tables are actually supported on the basic version.
No, yeah, I think you're right.
So,
All right.
And it is interesting because, I mean, when you look at
was running their product. So I think temporal tables are actually supported on the basic version.
No, yeah, I think you're right.
So,
Right.
And it is interesting because, I mean, when you look at and all of a sudden I can't remember the name of the edition. What's the edition that only allows you to go to 10 gigs?
That's Express.
Express, thank you.
I have a funny story about Express. Off the topic, a customer of mine had a customer, because they're a vendor, a customer that was running their product on Express Edition. They had 20 databases, and of course, Express has auto close enabled by default. So a typical diagnostic session, which takes 5 minutes normally, ran for 2 hours because it had auto close on every single database. So every time a query ran, it would close the connection, then open it again for the next query. It was fantastic.
Lots of overhead there.
So what were you going to say about Express Edition?
Well, I was going to say, because it's free, right? Then, I mean, and again, I at least might be the change there. Making this like Service Pack 1, some of those analytic features available in the Express Edition, that is a direct response to the MySQL ecosystem, right? And so I think to your point of like, well, hey, that's free. Now there is compute, right? So I guess there should be some cost there.
Yeah.
Right. But a database under 10 gigs should be pretty close to free, right?
Agreed.
That might, be the change there.
Yeah.
But I don't think a lot of people are going to take that into consideration because, even if they had to pay a penny, right? It's still, well, I have to pay something and this is quote unquote free.
Yeah, exactly.
Because those costs aren't directly to them.
Exactly. The other cost with Express Edition, which I love, is the 1 gigabyte limit of memory. So, this is
oh, right.
MySQL,
I had forgotten about that.
MySQL doesn't have that limit, obviously, but it is a strong consideration for not using Express.
Is that still the case in 2016?
Yes.
Okay. Huh.
Four CPU cores or 1 socket, whichever is smaller, 1 gig of RAM, and 10 gigabyte database size.
Gotcha.
So I would like to see a better costed version of Azure SQL Database for the standard level, if you like, and get rid of basic, because I don't see the point of basic. 5 DTUs isn't enough for anybody.
Sure.
I'm sure I've just coined a new phrase. And then just have standard and premium and have the standard do more for less, basically. Because I think the adoption would be higher if they did that.
Well, they've been coming down. I know the sizes have been getting larger. And so, maybe in another year or so, we'll get there.
Maybe by the time this podcast goes up.
Yeah. Who knows?
You never know.
You never know.
What's
goes up?
Yeah. Who knows?
You never know.
You never know.
So, what's the best piece of career advice that you've received?
I've been working for so long, I've probably forgotten most of what I've heard. But the one piece of advice I give to people, because I do some mentoring as well, is to say, be honest. So if you screw up, tell somebody that you screwed up. It's much easier to handle a problem if you're completely honest and say, this is what happened. This is how I created this problem. And then it's much easier to fix than lying and say, oh, I don't know how that happened. Or no, I did not kick the power supply out of the server. Or no, I did not accidentally bump this hard drive off the desk. Stuff like that. Just be honest. And it's just easier for people to handle the fallout. And if you're honest, it shows that you are honest. It shows that you are human. And there's nothing wrong with doing something wrong. I make mistakes all the time. The difference is I own up to them. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to get political. I'm going to stop here.
But it's interesting on that one, because I've heard people say that they're sometimes afraid to be honest because the environment they work in is too aggressive or management doesn't have your back on anything.
Well, then I wouldn't be working in that environment, and being honest and saying, yes, I did this gets you fired. Well, then any place is better than working in an environment like that. Toxic workplaces are very bad for your health, and you will die young.
Yep. And I think, though, what I was going to say around that is that if you are in that toxic work environment, and I've been there in the past, honesty is even better at that point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's always good, but it's
it's even more important at that point because you'll
They're not going to compromise whatever for the sake of
Yep.
looking good.
Yep. Very good advice.
If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Last time I said I have a superpower wherever I walk into a server room, a machine will either crash or not. Because that's the superpower I didn't want. But, there's been a whole lot of superhero movies recently, a whole lot of stuff that I don't enjoy because everybody's destroying everything. The one superhero I do like is Batman because he's not a superhero. He's just a guy. He does have compromised morals and he's very, very wealthy. I don't want to be wealthy like him because that also corrupts you. But
Sure.
I do like the idea of just being a decent person, necessarily killing bad guys, but just if you see something going wrong, speak up, say something. You don't have to be a superhero to be. So you don't have to be a superhero to say, that's wrong, this is not cool, and do something about it.
There you go. Randolph.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah, thanks so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me, and I'm sure this would have been a lot longer without the edits. So,
Yeah. No, it's great to have you on again and chat with you. And we'll look forward to seeing you in October.
sounds good. I'm looking forward to the Compañero Conference in Virginia, in Norfolk, on the 4th and 5th of October, 2017. And it's a single track, so you just have to stay in the same room and listen to people explain how awesome SQL Server and the cloud is.
We'll see you there.
That's right. Took the words right out of my mouth. So while still a new feature, Steve, I think it's going to be interesting how people begin to adopt this functionality and begin to put it in place.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So while still a new feature, Steve, I think it's going to be interesting how people begin to adopt this functionality and begin to put it in place.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can think of things that I would want to use it for right now.
Right. And that's one of those things that I also think it's one of those, I don't know if it's a borderline functionality. And by that, I mean, who's going to be implementing that, right? Is that more of a developer thing? Is it more of a DBA thing? Obviously, I think they'll take some coordination. Ultimately, even if the developers were to implement it, I'd obviously still want to understand it and know what it's doing, because obviously come report time or tuning time, what you can and can't do with it, they're going to come and ask you questions about it.
Yep. I know occasionally I've run across the problem where something changes in a table and people say, oh, we didn't change that. And then you find out later that, yes, somebody did change it. And it'd be very useful to be able to track those kind of things.
That's right. That's right. Or if you've been playing around with it, we'd love to hear from you as well. Always interested in getting some of that feedback.
Or if you listen to this episode and you're hearing about it for the first time and you decide to go use it, we'd love to hear how temporal tables go for you.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's see. I think that's going to be it for today's episode. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to give us feedback, if there's topics you want to hear about, you can reach out to us on any of the social media platforms and connect with us on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I'm on LinkedIn as Steve Stedman. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail.